The air was thick with humidity as Richard Hardrove pushed open the warped wooden doors of the old barn, the hinges groaning like tired bones. He had walked the same path every morning for decades, boots sinking into the damp soil, the smell of hay and livestock settling into his lungs the way it always did. Normally, by now, the pigs would be grunting and restless, eager for feed, their snorts carrying into the dawn. But this morning was different. The silence felt wrong and natural, as if the entire barn was holding its breath. Richard slowed, his hand tightening around the lantern he carried, its faint light flickering across beams darkened with age and dust. He stepped inside, and the stillness wrapped around him like a shroud. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Animals know. When the master is gone, don't ever neglect them, son. They feel it. But this wasn't neglect. This was something else. The pigs weren't moving. They huddled in corners, eyes alert, bodies rigid, watching not him, but something behind him, something deeper in the shadows. Richard swallowed, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple as he raised the lantern higher. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that the fog of sleep had followed him into the barn, in the driest corner of the pen, where the straw was piled loosely and the air carried a faint draft. 3 small figures lay curled together, children, blonde hair tangled like spun hay, small bodies pressed against one another, their dresses identical, pale blue and frayed at the seams, dusty from the ground, bare feet, smudged faces, lips slightly parted in the kind of deep sleep that belongs to innocence. They weren't stirring, weren't shivering, weren't crying, just sleeping, as if the chaos of the world had chosen not to disturb them. Richard's heart hammered. His first thought was absurd, that they were ghosts, apparitions born of memory and guilt. He blinked hard, rubbed the back of his neck, and stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. No, they were real. He could see their chests rise and fall, shallow breaths breaking the barn's suffocating silence. He could smell the faint, sour tang of children who had been traveling, who hadn't bathed in days. His throat went dry. What is this?" he whispered, voice cracking in the cavernous quiet. He knelt, his knees pressing into the hay, and reached out with a hand that had known both the weight of cattle ropes and the precision of signing million-dollar contracts. His touch, usually steady, trembled as he rested his palm gently against the shoulder of the nearest girl. She stirred faintly, lashes fluttering, before her eyes opened and fixed on him. For a heartbeat, Richard felt the world tilt. Those eyes blue, wide, unblinking, looked at him not with fear, but with recognition, as though she had been waiting for him. The other 2 girls didn't move. One of them clutched something tightly in her tiny fist. Richard leaned closer and saw it glint in the lantern's glow, a necklace, red beads strung together, crude but familiar. His breath caught. He knew. It instantly, the memory came flooding back, sharpened and relentless. Caroline, his daughter, standing on the porch at 15, grinning shyly as he handed her the necklace he had saved up for, his first true gift to her after a hard year on the farm. That necklace had been lost with her in the crash, or so he had believed. Richard staggered back onto his heels, heart pounding in his ears. He looked down at the girls again, disbelief twisting with something deeper in his chest. Grief, hope, fear. They weren't just children abandoned in his barn. They were a message, a secret delivered straight into his life by hands unseen. He stood abruptly, lantern shaking, eyes darting to the barn walls. The soil near the entrance caught his attention, softened by the previous night's rain. Footprints, small ones, leading to where the girls lay, and larger ones beside them, but none leaving. The silence deepened. Even the pigs refused to stir, their bodies tense, eyes glinting in the shadows. Richard's breath came uneven, his pulse racing with the certainty that this morning had changed everything. He didn't know who these girls were, or why they had been left in his barn. But some part of him, the part that had never stopped mourning Caroline, whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. These children belonged to him, not by law, not by reason, but by blood and fate. He clenched the lantern tighter, the glass trembling in its frame, and whispered to the sleeping forms, "God help me. Who are you?" The barn gave no answer, only the echo of his voice fading into the dawn, while the Triplet girls slept on, their breathing steady, as if they already knew he was theirs. The farmhouse had always been a place of comfort, the kind of home where the scent of brewed coffee and baked bread used to greet him, long before the sun rose. But that morning, Richard Hardrove sat at the dining table with his calloused hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since grown cold. Staring at the walls as though they held secrets he wasn't ready to hear. Upstairs, in the old guest room, the three girls lay tucked under blankets that smelled faintly of lavender. Mrs. Peterson, his housekeeper of over 2 decades, hovered like a mother hen, fussing over them as though they were her own grandchildren. The house should have felt alive, yet it was steeped in a quiet tension that made Richard's chest ache. He could still see the way the eldest girl had looked at him in the barn, her eyes unblinking, filled with an impossible recognition that had rattled him to his core. And then the necklace, that cursed, beloved necklace, glinting in the lantern light. It was impossible. Caroline was gone. Everyone had told him so. The wreckage of the car, the authorities' words, the funeral service where he had stood, hollow inside. He had grieved, buried her in his heart, and poured his pain into his work. Yet now, staring at the steamless tea, he wondered if he had been living inside a lie. The floorboards creaked behind him, and Mrs. Peterson appeared, her expression grave. "This isn't right, Mr. Hardrove," she murmured, setting a hand on the back of a chair. "Children don't just fall from the sky, and 3 of them, identical. Someone placed them here, like a message or a warning." Her voice shook, though she tried to sound practical. Richard exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know," he admitted. "I called Sheriff Donovan. He's sending someone." Mrs. Peterson pressed her lips tight, then lowered her voice. "And what will you tell him about the necklace?" Richard froze. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment he felt exposed, as though his grief had been laid bare for everyone to see. "Nothing," he whispered. "Not yet." By mid-morning, the rumble of a patrol car echoed down the dirt road. Sheriff Donovan stepped out, his wide frame filling the porch, had pulled low against the glare of the sun. He wasn't alone. A young woman followed, a social worker named Laura, clipboard in hand, her sharp eyes scanning the property like she was cataloging every detail. Richard explained what he had seen in the barn, the silence, the footprints, the girls asleep in the hay. Donovan listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. But Richard noticed the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned the footprints leading in and not out. Laura inspected the children, crouching low to meet their eyes, but the triplets pressed closer together, whispering in that strange, fragmented language that sounded almost invented. One of them tugged at Laura's sleeve, but when she leaned closer, the child only repeated a single word over and over, in a voice so soft it was nearly lost in the quiet of the room. "Home." Laura frowned. "They're not malnourished," she told Richard after a pause. "Dirty, yes, cold, but someone cared for them. They've been hidden, not abandoned." The words made Richard's stomach churn. "Hidden? From what? From whom? Will they go to a shelter?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice trembled. "Normally, yes," Laura replied. "But it's Saturday, every shelter is full, and the county is tied up with the fair. I can authorize temporary custody until Monday." She hesitated, watching him carefully. With supervision, Richard didn't even need to think. "They can stay here," he said quickly, his voice firm. "It's safe here." That night, the farm seemed to sink deeper into its own silence. The girls were asleep again upstairs, curled together under the quilt Mrs. Peterson had laid over them, but Richard couldn't rest. He sat on the porch, lantern by his side, staring into the fog as it rolled low across the fields. His heart pounded with questions that refused to quiet. Who had brought them here? Why his barn? And why the necklace? He felt the cold weight of it even now, sitting in his pocket where he had slipped it after gently prying it from the child's hand. As the night deepened, the farm settled into uneasy stillness. Then he heard it, faint, almost imagined. Footsteps, not the heavy tread of farm hands, not the shuffle of animals, but light, deliberate steps moving just beyond the edge of the porch. He stood, lantern shaking in his grip, and peered into the fog. Nothing. The fields were empty, the trees unmoving, yet he felt eyes on him, watching from somewhere just out of sight. The pigs in the barn stirred then, grunting anxiously as though they, too, had sensed the presence. Richard's skin prickled. He whispered to the night, his voice rough, "If you're out there, show yourself." No answer came, only silence. But when he turned back toward the house, his breath caught. On the fog-dampened soil at the edge of the steps lay a new set, of footprints, larger than the children's, pressed deep into the earth, leading up to the porch. And stopping there, Richard's grip on the lantern tightened, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Someone had been there, standing within arm's reach of his home, watching, and they had left without a sound. Upstairs, the triplets stirred in their sleep, one of them whispering that strange word again, home. Richard froze where he stood, dread flooding through him as he realized the girls weren't just lost. Someone had left them here for him, and someone might come back to claim them. The rooster crowed before the first light of dawn, but Richard had been awake all night. Sleep was impossible. His mind replayed the image of the footprints pressed into the wet soil, the way they ended at his porch, as though whoever stood there had lingered, watching, listening, deciding. His gut twisted with the knowledge that he hadn't imagined it. Someone had been here. Someone had come close enough to touch the door. When the farmhands began stirring, Richard was already in the barn. Lanterns still lit from the night before. He moved among the stalls with his jaw tight, checking for signs, for something left behind. Nothing, only restless animals. He stood in the dim light, staring at the spot where he had first seen the children. The hay was disturbed, but the memory felt more vivid than the ground itself, as if the barn wanted to erase the truth. He was still there when the low rumble of an engine drifted over the fields. A battered blue school bus rattled slowly down the dirt road, headlights faint in the mist. Richard frowned, watching as it crept toward the barn before stopping abruptly. The driver's door swung open, and Henry Cole climbed down. Henry had driven that bus route for years, though the schools were half empty now. He wasn't a man people paid much attention to, mid-50s, balding, clothes always one wash away from being respectable. But there was something about the way he paused at the bottom of the steps, eyes sweeping across the barn, that set Richard on edge. Henry spotted him, forced a grin, and lifted a hand. "Morning, Mr. Hardrove," Henry said, voice too cheerful for the hour. "Thought I'd stop by. Had some deliveries to drop in town. Figured I'd swing past, see if you needed anything, Hull?" Richard studied him in silence. The man's hands trembled slightly as he shoved them into his pockets. It wasn't just nervousness, it was guilt. Richard had spent decades in business deals, reading men like ledgers. He knew guilt when he saw it. "Strange time to check on me," Richard said at last, his voice steady. "You don't usually come by this early." Henry hesitated, eyes darting to the barn door, then back. "Couldn't sleep. You know how it is." He forced a chuckle. "Besides, folks are saying strange things in town. 3 little girls found out here on your land. Rumors travel faster than your cattle, I swear." Richard's stomach nodded. "And how would you know that already?" Henry's grin faltered. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the snort of a restless horse. Finally, Henry shifted, looking down at his boots. "Because I've seen them before." The words landed like a hammer. Richard stepped forward, his fist clenching. "What do you mean you've seen them before?" Henry swallowed hard, sweat gathering at his brow despite the cool air. "At the gas station 2 weeks ago, late at night, a woman brought them in. Blonde, thin, looked worn out, like she'd been running for miles. She bought food and left quick. The girls were dressed the same way they are now. Same hair, same faces. I never forgot them." His voice cracked. "I think she knew I recognized her." Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. Recognized her? Who was she? Henry hesitated again, then finally whispered the name Richard had buried under years of grief. "Caroline." The world tilted. Richard staggered back, gripping the edge of a stall to steady himself. Caroline, his daughter, the one who had been declared dead, the one he had mourned every day since that night. "You're lying," Richard said hoarsely, though part of him didn't believe it. "Caroline is gone. I buried her." Henry shook his head violently. "No, you buried what they told you to bury. I saw her, Richard, alive, and she had those girls with her." He pointed toward the house with a trembling finger. "Your grandchildren." The word hit Richard harder than any blow ever could. He stumbled toward Henry, grabbing him by the collar. "Why didn't you say something sooner? Why didn't you tell me?" Henry's face twisted with shame. "Because she begged me not to. She said people were after her, said they'd come for the girls if anyone knew. I thought if I kept my mouth shut, I'd keep her safe. I didn't think she'd leave them here. I swear I didn't." Richard released him with a shove, chest heaving, rage and sorrow colliding inside him. You should have told me, he hissed. Henry rubbed at his throat, guilt written in every line of his face. I thought I was protecting her, but now I think she's in danger, real danger, and those kids are the proof. Before Richard could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from the house. One of the girls appeared in the doorway, clutching the red bead necklace in her tiny hand. She looked at Richard, then at Henry, her eyes filled with something neither man could read: fear, or perhaps recognition. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the child whispered a single word that froze them both in place: Papa. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Henry went pale. The pigs squealed suddenly in their pens, restless and agitated, as if warning of something unseen. Richard looked past the girl, toward the fog curling along the fields, and a chill washed over him. Somewhere out there, in the shifting mist, someone was still watching. The fog clung to the fields long after the sun had risen, as though the world itself didn't want to reveal what lay beyond. Richard Hardrove stood at the porch railing, staring into the gray veil, his hands trembling despite the calluses earned from years of work. Behind him, the triplets played in the parlor under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye. Their laughter should have been a balm, but instead it unsettled him. It was too soft, too synchronized, like the sound of a single voice, echoing 3 times. Every so often, he would catch them whispering to each other in that strange, cobbled language. Not English, not anything he could recognize, though fragments of words slipped through: Papa, home, and sometimes Caroline. Each time he heard his daughter's name fall from their lips, his chest tightened until he couldn't breathe. Sheriff Donovan had returned briefly that morning to ask questions. He sat across from Richard at the kitchen table, pen scratching against his notepad. "You're sure no one's been back?" Donovan asked. Richard glanced toward the window, remembering the heavy footprints pressed into the wet soil outside. "His porch. No one I could see." The sheriff studied him carefully. "You've got enemies, Richard. Land disputes, lawsuits, jealous rivals. And now 3 little girls show up on your property out of nowhere? This doesn't smell like coincidence." Richard wanted to argue, but the truth stuck in his throat. Donovan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If these girls are tied to your past, someone out there knows it. And if they left them here, it wasn't just to keep them safe. It was to send you a message." The words gnawed at Richard long after Donovan left. By afternoon, Henry Cole came back. The bus driver's face was drawn, his hands trembling as he removed his cap and twisted it nervously. "I didn't tell you everything," Henry confessed, his voice breaking. "That night at the gas station, Caroline, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her. Tall, sharp face, eyes like stone. He didn't speak, just watched. And when she left, he followed her into the dark. That's why I kept quiet. Whoever he was, he scared me half to death." Richard's jaw tightened. "And you think he's the one who brought the girls here?" Henry nodded, pale. "I don't know who else it could be." That night, Richard locked every door and window, though the act felt hollow, like closing a gate on a storm. He sat in his study long after midnight, the red bead necklace spread across his desk. He couldn't stop staring at it. The beads caught the moonlight in a way that made them look almost alive. Caroline's necklace, his daughter's necklace, the same one now tied to the girls upstairs who whispered her name in their sleep. A sound broke through the silence, a creak on the stairs. Richard stiffened. He reached for the shotgun that leaned against the wall, heart pounding as he moved into the hallway. The house was still, yet the sound came again, soft feet on wood. He turned the corner, ready to confront an intruder. It wasn't a stranger. It was one of the triplets, the eldest. She stood halfway down the staircase, clutching the necklace in her small fist. Her eyes locked on his with that same unsettling recognition. Slowly, she lifted her other hand and pointed toward the front door. Richard's breath caught. "What is it, sweetheart?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered in her strange, broken language, words spilling like fragments of a dream. The only one Richard understood chilled him to the marrow. Watching, he turned to the door, lantern trembling in his hand. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable, but as the flame flickered, he saw it to shadows moving across the field, figures too large to be tricks of light. They stopped at the edge of the property and simply stood there, motionless, their outlines sharp against the mist. Richard gripped the shotgun tighter, fury rising with his fear. Whoever they were playing a game with his family. He would not allow it. He would not lose another child. But when he looked back, the girl was gone, as though she'd melted into the air. He rushed upstairs, heart hammering, only to find all three triplets asleep in their bed, their chests rising and falling in perfect unison. The necklace lay on the nightstand beside them, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Richard staggered back, a chill crawling up his spine. He had seen her. She had pointed to the door. Yet here she was, sleeping peacefully as though she had never left. Outside, the shadows dissolved into the fog. Richard pressed his back against the wall, breath ragged. The girls weren't just tied to Caroline. They were tied to something larger, something watching him from the edges of his land, pressing closer each night. And deep inside, beneath the fear, he felt a terrifying certainty. The strangers in the mist weren't just after the girls. They were after him too. The dawn broke heavy with clouds, the kind that made the air feel thick and metallic. As though the sky itself carried a warning, Richard hadn't slept. His boots were still muddy from pacing the porch through the night, shotgun always within reach. The image of those two figures standing in the fog would not leave his mind. They hadn't moved closer, hadn't spoken, but their presence had said enough. We know. We're watching. Inside the farmhouse, the girls slept soundly, as if untouched by fear, but Richard noticed things, the way they sometimes all stirred at once, like three hearts beating to the same rhythm, the way they whispered to one another in that broken tongue, stopping abruptly when he entered the room, the way the eldest clutched the red bead necklace whenever she sensed his eyes on her. They weren't ordinary children, not in the way they moved, not in the way they seemed to carry secrets far too old for their tiny frames. By mid-morning, the crunch of tires on gravel made Richard stiffen. He strode out onto the porch, shotgun still leaning casually against the doorframe. The old blue bus rattled to a stop again. Coughing smoke, Hemicole stepped down slowly, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched. His hands twisted his cap nervously. He looked as though he'd aged 10 years overnight. Richard's voice was sharp. "You've got more to say, don't you?" Henry froze, then nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "I couldn't keep it in, Richard, not anymore." He shuffled closer, his eyes darting to the windows of the farmhouse, as though afraid the girls might overhear. "I told you Caroline was alive. I told you I saw her, but I didn't tell you the rest." Richard stepped down off the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, then spit it out. "No more half-truths." Henry's hands shook as he clutched his cap. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Caroline came to me the night of the accident. She was bleeding, barefoot, carrying those babies wrapped in nothing but old quilts. She told me someone tried to kill her, that the crash wasn't an accident. She said men were after her, men who wanted what she knew. She begged me to hide her, to hide them." Richard's chest tightened, his throat raw. "Why didn't you come to me? Why keep this from me?" Henry's eyes glistened. "Because she made me swear. She said you'd be the first man they'd watch. Your money, your land, your name. It put a target on her back. She said if you even knew she was alive, they'd use you to get to her. So I helped her vanish." His voice cracked. "But I couldn't keep her safe forever." Richard grabbed Henry by the collar, slamming him against the side of the bus. His fury trembled in his hands. "Where is she?" he demanded. Henry's lips trembled, his eyes darting to the fog rolling at the edge of the fields. "I don't know anymore. I haven't seen her in months. The last time, she told me if anything happened, if she couldn't come back, she'd leave the girls where you'd find them." His voice broke, and that's exactly what she did. The words landed like a hammer blow. Richard staggered back, releasing Henry, his breath coming ragged. His daughter had been alive all this time, and now she was gone again, leaving only these three children, his grandchildren, like fragile evidence of her existence. Before Richard could respond, a scream cut through the air, high-pitched. From the house, the girls. Richard and Henry sprinted toward the porch, boots pounding against the dirt. Mrs. Peterson burst out the front door, her face pale as chalk. "They're gone," she cried, her voice shaking. "I turned my back for 1 minute and they were gone." Richard's heart lurched. He shoved past her into the parlor. The blankets lay crumpled on the floor, the room empty. Only the faint sound of a door swinging shut echoed through the house. He tore through the kitchen and out the back, shotgun clutched tight. And then he froze. The girls were there, standing barefoot in the yard, their dresses whipping in the wind. They weren't screaming now. They weren't crying. They stood in a line, shoulder to shoulder, facing the fog at the edge of the fields. Their small hands were clasped together. Richard's breath caught as two shadows emerged from the mist. Figures, tall and deliberate, their faces obscured, their steps silent. The girls didn't move. They only whispered to one another, words Richard couldn't understand. Until suddenly the eldest turned her head and looked straight at him, her lips parted, her voice clear as crystal. For the first time, they've come for us, Papa. Richard raised his shotgun, fury and terror surging through him. Henry stumbled to his side, eyes wide with dread. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the fog parting around them like curtains drawn back for a performance. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. He had lost Caroline once. He would not lose these girls, not again. Over my dead body, he muttered, sighting down the barrel. And in that moment, Richard realized the truth. This was no longer about coincidence. The children weren't just abandoned. They were bait, and the trap had already closed around him. The wind howled across the fields, bending the corn stalks like waves on a restless ocean. Richard Hardrove stood in the yard, shotgun tight in his grip, his pulse hammering in his ears. The three little girls were still shoulder to shoulder, barefoot in the grass, their dresses whipping in the gusts. Behind them, Mrs. Peterson sobbed softly on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. Henry Cole, pale as death, hovered at Richard's side, his lips quivering as though 1,000 confessions pressed at the back of his throat. The figures in the fog advanced slowly, with a kind of calculated patience that made Richard's skin crawl. They were tall, dressed in dark coats despite the warmth of the morning, their hats low, hiding their faces. He raised the barrel of his shotgun, the weight steady, but his hands not. He wasn't a man to aim at shadows, but these weren't shadows. These were men, men who had come for his grandchildren. "Stay where you are," Richard roared, his voice booming across the fields. "Another step and you'll regret it." The figures didn't stop. They didn't even flinch. One of them lifted his hand in a mocking gesture, palm up, as if inviting Richard to shoot. The eldest girl tugged at her sister's hands, whispering in that strange, fractured language. But Richard caught one word clear, sharp, cutting through. The noise like a bell. Caroline. The sound nearly dropped him to his knees. His daughter's name, carried on the lips of a child who looked at him as though she already knew the shape of his soul. Henry stumbled forward, voice cracking. "Richard, listen to me. They're not here for you. They're here because Caroline knew something. She told me they wanted it, whatever secret she carried. And the girls are the key." Richard's head snapped toward him. "What secret?" Henry's face twisted with shame. "I don't know. She wouldn't say. Only that they'd stop at nothing, and if they couldn't have her, they'd take what was left of her." He jabbed a finger toward the triplets. Them. The men in the fog drew closer. Richard fired a warning shot into the air, the crack splitting the silence like lightning. Birds scattered from the trees. The figures paused at last, but they didn't retreat. Instead, one of them spoke, his voice low and smooth, carrying effortlessly through the mist. "Mr. Hardrove," the man called, almost politely, "we're not here to harm you. Hand over the girls, and we'll be gone before sundown." The words slammed into Richard with the force of a hammer. "Hand them over." His jaw clenched so hard it ached. He stepped in front of the girls, shielding them with his own body. "Over my dead body." He spat. The silence that followed was long, cold, and heavy. Then the second man chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. "That can be arranged." Before Richard could react, the triplets began humming, low at first, then louder, their voices weaving together into something eerie and otherworldly. It wasn't the sound of frightened children, it was purposeful. Like a melody they had sung 1,000 times in secret. The air seemed to vibrate with it, carrying a weight Richard couldn't explain. The men in the fog faltered, their steady march slowed, their shoulders tensed. One raised his hand as if to block the sound, and Richard realized whatever this strange song was, it unsettled them, terrified them. The eldest girl clutched Richard's pant leg now, eyes fierce. "Papa," she whispered, her English halting, but clear. "No give us. Fight." Richard's throat closed, tears threatening, rage boiling. He swung the shotgun back toward the men, aiming steady. "You heard her," he growled. "You'll leave my land, or you'll leave in pieces." Henry, trembling, stepped closer. "Richard, you don't understand. This isn't just about you. Caroline uncovered something years ago, something about these men, about their business. She told me they'd come after her children because the children carry what she couldn't. Richard snarled, and what's that? Henry's eyes burned. With fear, the truth, proof of what these men did. The words were barely out when the fog broke. More figures emerged, 4, 5, maybe more. They surrounded the property like wolves closing in on prey. The triplets squeezed each other's hands tighter, their humming swelling until even the windows of the farmhouse rattled in their pains. Richard's heart pounded, but for the first time since the barn, he felt something shift. The girls weren't helpless. Whatever they carried inside them, it was enough to make grown men hesitate, enough to make shadows stumble. One of the men barked an order in a language Richard didn't understand, and the others advanced. Richard raised his shotgun, pulled the trigger, and the blast thundered through the air. One man fell, the others scattering briefly before regrouping. The humming rose higher, louder, and then silence. The fog thickened, swallowing the attackers. As though the land itself had turned against them, when it cleared, they were gone. Richard stood shaking, chest heaving, shotgun still smoking. The girls collapsed against him, clutching his legs, their small bodies trembling now that the danger had passed. Mrs. Peterson sobbed with relief on the porch. Henry stared into the empty fields, his face pale, whispering, "They'll come back. They always come back." Richard knelt, gathering the triplets in his arms. Their tiny hands gripped his shirt, their eyes wide but unbroken. He kissed their tangled hair and whispered fiercely, "They'll have to kill me first." But deep inside, he knew Henry was right. This wasn't over. The men hadn't come just to scare him. They wanted the children for something far bigger, something tied to Caroline's disappearance. And until he uncovered the truth, no amount of guns or fences would keep them safe. For the first time in his life, Richard felt the ground beneath him shift, not because of drought or death, but because fate itself had chosen him to stand between these children and the darkness hunting them. And as the sun burned through the fog, one thought echoed in his mind: Caroline is still out there, and these men won't stop until they find her or bury the truth with us all. The morning after the attack, the farm no longer felt like his. Richard Hardrove had lived on this land since birth, built his fortune from its soil. But as he stood on the porch with the triplets huddled close, the property seemed foreign-like. It belonged to something else now. The cornfields, once symbols of his success, swayed uneasily in the breeze. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind carried whispers that weren't their dot. Mrs. Peterson kept the girls inside, braiding their hair and feeding them warm porridge, her old hands steady though her face betrayed the tremors of fear. Henry sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, muttering that the men would return. He looked like a man waiting for a punishment he knew he deserved. Richard, however, couldn't sit still. His mind was gnawed by one question: what secret had Caroline carried, and why were her daughters the key? As if to answer, the eldest triplet appeared in the doorway, clutching the red bead necklace. She walked with quiet determination, her bare feet padding across the porch until she stopped in front of Richard. She lifted the necklace high, her small voice whispering a single word: letter. Richard's breath caught. "What did you say?" "Letter," she repeated, her accent broken, but her eyes unyielding. He crouched to meet her gaze. "Where?" The child turned, pointing toward the old barn, the place where he had first found them. Without hesitation, Richard took the lantern and led the way, Henry stumbling after him. Inside, the air smelled of damp hay and earth, but the girl moved as if guided by memory. She crossed to the far wall, pressed her small palm against a loose board, and pulled. The wood creaked, revealing a hollow space stuffed with straw. And there was a tin box, rusted at the edges, sealed tight with a leather strap. Richard's hand shook as he opened it. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed by moisture, but still legible. His heart pounded as he unfolded it, his daughter's handwriting sprawling across the page. "Father," it began, "if you are reading this, I could not stay. The men who tried to kill me still hunt us. I survived the crash, but not the life I had. I ran because I discovered something I wasn't supposed to know. The company you sold soy contracts to Glenwood Industries, they're not what they claim. They launder money through the farms, mine included. I found proof so dangerous they killed to silence me. I hid it where only blood could find it. The truth is locked inside the girls, not in their hands, but in their names, in the papers I carried when they were born. Find them, protect them. If you do, you'll bring down the men who think they own this town." The letter blurred as Richard's eyes filled. Caroline had been alive, fighting a war alone while he buried an empty coffin. She had raised these girls in hiding, knowing one day he would have to finish what she started. He pressed the paper to his chest, a sob tearing through him. Henry's voice quavered. Richard, if that letter's true, you're not just fighting for those girls. You're fighting against men who own sheriffs, judges, politicians. If Glenwood falls, half the county falls with it. Richard wiped his face, rage cutting through grief. Then let it fall. But before he could say more, the youngest girl cried out. She was staring at the barn door. Richard spun, shotgun raised. Another figure stood in the threshold, silhouetted by daylight. Slim, hair tangled, clothes torn from travel, but alive. Caroline. His daughter's name slipped from his lips like a prayer. She stepped forward, tears spilling down her cheeks as her daughters broke from the hay and ran into her arms. She fell to her knees, clutching them, kissing their hair, whispering their names through sobs. Richard's vision swam, the world tilting as decades of grief and guilt collapsed into the sight of his child alive. He stumbled toward her, hands trembling as if afraid she might vanish. But before he reached her, the roar of engines shattered the moment. Trucks tore down the dirt road, black SUVs kicking up clouds of dust. Men poured out, armed and determined, their eyes locked on the barn. Glenwood's men, the hunters, had arrived. Caroline pulled the girls behind her, eyes wide with terror. They'll kill us, she gasped. They'll never let the truth out. Richard stepped in front of her, his shotgun raised, his body a wall between his family and the intruders. His voice, rough with years of silence, thundered with new resolve. Not while I'm still breathing. The first shots cracked through the air, splintering the barn door. Richard fired back, his rage steadying his aim. Henry grabbed a pitchfork. Joining the fight with desperate fury, the triplets huddled behind Caroline, clutching the red bead necklace, their humming rising again, a strange, haunting sound that seemed to thicken the air, rattling the very bones of the men who dared approach. The battle for the farm had begun. And in that moment, Richard realized the shocking truth. This wasn't just about protecting his grandchildren. It was about tearing down an empire of corruption. Caroline had been right. The proof wasn't in papers or bank ledgers. The proof was alive, breathing, humming in the voices of three little girls who carried both his blood and his daughter's secret. As bullets tore through the barn and the fog rose once more across the fields, Richard knew there would be no turning back. This fight was his legacy. This fight was family, and by the end of it, the whole world would know the name Hardrove again, not for cattle, not for soybeans, but for the truth his daughter had died to protect and his granddaughters were destined to reveal.